Have you ever met someone who was treated like he did not matter at all until the very day he proved he mattered more than everyone in the room? That is exactly what happened to Daniel. And trust me, by the end of this story, the same people who laughed at him were the same people begging him not to leave. So stay with me, because this one gets colder, deeper, and more satisfying with every minute. Daniel was the kind of man most offices never notice until something breaks. He was not loud. He did not brag. He did not try to be the center of attention. He just came to work early, stayed late, fixed what was broken, solved problems before anyone even knew they existed, and did it all without asking for applause. He was a skilled worker, the kind of employee every serious company says it wants. But in reality, the people around him did not value skill. They valued ego. And Daniel worked under a boss named Richard Hale, a man who wore expensive suits, spoke with fake confidence, and treated kindness like weakness. Richard had a small group of followers in the office too. There was Melissa from finance, who laughed at whatever Richard said. There was Trent from operations, who copied Richard's rude behavior just to look important. And there was Karen, the office manager, who knew everything but said nothing unless it helped her survive. These people had one thing in common. They saw Daniel as easy to use. Not because he was weak, but because he was quiet. Every day they took advantage of that quiet. If a deadline was missed, they blamed Daniel. If a report had a problem, they blamed Daniel. If a client was unhappy, somehow Daniel's name came up first. And Daniel, he just stood there, calm, serious, and steady. He never shouted. He never begged. He never acted desperate to prove himself. But inside, it hurt. It hurt deeply. Because Daniel was not lazy. He was not stupid. He was not careless. He was the reason half the office ran smoothly. He fixed the mistakes others made. He cleaned up the messes no one wanted to touch. He protected the company's work from falling apart. And still, Richard would smirk and say things like, "Daniel, you're good at one thing, following instructions." Then the others would laugh. Not because it was funny, but because they wanted to stay on the boss's good side. And Daniel would nod and keep working. That was the pattern. Day after day. Week after week, until one morning, Richard called a meeting. Daniel was sitting with his usual quiet expression while everyone gathered around the conference table. Richard leaned back in his chair, looked at Daniel, and said in front of everyone, "Honestly, I'm not sure why we still keep him around. He's competent enough, I guess, but not exactly leadership material." The room went silent for 1 second. Then Melissa laughed nervously. Trent smirked. Karen looked down at her notes. And Daniel, who had done nothing wrong, was forced to sit there and swallow the humiliation like it was part of his job description. Richard continued, "Some people just don't have that spark. They do enough to survive, not enough to stand out." That sentence landed like a slap. Daniel looked down at the table. No one defended him. Not a single person. That was the moment something inside him changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. A deep, cold realization. They were never going to respect him. Not because he lacked value, but because they depended on him staying silent. And for the first time, Daniel stopped thinking like a victim. He started thinking like a man who had been underestimated for too long. That night, instead of going home and sleeping, he stayed late. Not because he had work to finish. Because he had a question in his mind. Why was Richard always so arrogant? Why did Melissa always look so nervous when certain budget reports came up? Why did some invoices not match? Why were there hidden transfers buried inside the monthly financial records? Daniel had always been good with numbers. Better than most people knew. His job in the office was technical. But because he was trusted with certain system access, he often saw patterns others ignored. And once he started looking closely, the patterns became impossible to ignore. At first, it was small things. Strange vendor payments, duplicate invoice entries, consulting fees sent to a company that barely existed, a reimbursement approved by Richard himself, but with no receipt. Then Daniel found something bigger. A private account linked to a shell business, a family member's name attached to one of the transactions, and a series of payments that looked less like business expenses and more like a cover-up. Daniel stared at the screen, his face empty, his heart beating hard. This was not just messy accounting. This was corruption. Real corruption. The kind that could destroy careers. There were transactions linked to Trent's travel claims, inflated beyond reason. And there was one final discovery that chilled Daniel completely. Richard had been moving company money into accounts tied to a personal investment project that was quietly failing. Meaning, if the truth came out, Richard was not just guilty. He was exposed. And if Richard fell, the people around him would fall too. Daniel sat in the dark after seeing that file. He did not smile. He did not feel victorious. He felt heavy, because he knew exactly what kind of war he had just stepped into. The next week, the pressure at work got worse. Richard started picking on him more openly. Every mistake became Daniel's fault. Every delay became Daniel's problem. At one point, Richard threw a folder onto Daniel's desk and said, "You know what your issue is? You think being quiet makes you smart. It just makes you easy to ignore." That was the kind of sentence that could break a person. But Daniel did not break. He simply looked at Richard and said, "Understood." Nothing else. Richard hated that. Cowardice can feed on emotion. It cannot feed on calm. So Richard tried a different tactic. He brought Daniel into a meeting with the others and said, "We need to discuss performance." Melissa folded her arms. Trent leaned back like he was about to watch a show. Karen kept staring at her screen. Richard looked straight at Daniel and said, "Several people have raised concerns that you're not a team player. You don't communicate enough. You make people uncomfortable. And frankly, your attitude is not helping morale." Daniel listened without interrupting. Then Richard said the real threat. "We may need to consider whether this role is still the right fit for you." That meant one thing. They wanted him gone. Not because of bad work, because Daniel was too competent to keep ignoring, and too quiet to fight back. And that night, while most people would have felt defeated, Daniel made his final decision. If they wanted to push him out, he would not leave empty-handed. Melissa's face drained of color. Trent stopped smiling. Karen, who had been standing by the door, froze like she had seen a ghost. Richard looked at the papers but still tried to act superior. "What is this?" Daniel's voice stayed low. "It's everything." Richard laughed once, but it sounded fake even to him. "Everything about what?" Daniel opened the first page. "Everything about the money." Silence. Daniel continued, calm as ever. "The shell vendor, the duplicate reimbursements, the private transfers, the false approvals, the account under your cousin's company name, the travel expenses that were never real, the consulting contract no one reviewed, and the personal investment scheme you funded using company money." No one spoke, not even Richard. Daniel turned one page after another, explaining each item like a man reading a death certificate. Melissa whispered, "How did you get this?" Daniel looked straight at her. "The same way I do my job. Carefully." Richard stood up so fast his chair almost fell. "You stole company records." Daniel shook his head. "I documented company corruption." That sentence hit harder than any shout could. Richard snapped, "You have no idea what you're doing. Hand that over right now." Daniel did not move. For the first time in that office, Richard looked afraid. Not angry, not arrogant, afraid. Because he understood something Daniel had known for days. The evidence was complete. It was organized. It was real. And it was enough to destroy him. Richard tried to recover. "Even if this is true, you think anyone will believe you over me?" Daniel answered, without raising his voice. "They will when they see the full trail." Trent jumped in, suddenly sweating. Wait, let's all calm down. We can talk about this. Karen finally found her voice. Richard, is this real? Richard glared at her. Stay out of this. But Daniel could see it now. The first crack, then the second. Because people who build their power on lies always think everyone else will stay loyal, until the moment they realize nobody wants to drown with them. Richard took a breath and lowered his voice. What do you want? That was the first honest thing he had said all year. Daniel looked at him steadily. I want you to stop pretending I was ever the problem. Richard said nothing. Daniel continued. You insulted me in front of the office. You used me to fix your mistakes. You blamed me for things I never did. You treated me like I was replaceable. He paused. Now I know the truth. I was never replaceable. I was just the one person in this room who actually paid attention. Melissa swallowed hard. Trent looked at the floor. Karen stared at the folder like it might bite her. Richard's face hardened, but his voice changed. What exactly do you plan to do with this? Daniel picked up his bag slowly. Then he said the line that changed everything. I already resigned. Richard blinked. Daniel placed a resignation letter on the desk. Signed. Dated. Final. Then he said, I'm leaving on my own terms. The room went still. Richard stared at him. You can't just walk out with company evidence. Daniel replied, I didn't walk out with anything that isn't already documented. You built this mess. I simply preserved the truth. Then he looked at the others one by one. If you think I'm leaving this quietly, you're mistaken. Richard's voice rose. But Daniel cut him off. No, you do not get to say my name like that now. And for the first time, Richard had nothing to say. Daniel turned to leave, then stopped at the door and looked back. I spent years doing my job while you all acted like I was beneath you. You thought silence meant weakness. It never did. It meant I was watching. That was the moment the room fully collapsed. Because Daniel was not bluffing. He had already made copies. He had already secured the files. He had already prepared to send them to the right people. He had already protected himself. And he knew exactly how to make the truth impossible to bury. By the end of that afternoon, the office was in panic. Richard called legal. Legal called compliance. Compliance called the board. The board demanded documents. Documents were checked. Emails were reviewed. Transactions were verified. And one by one, the lies began falling apart. Melissa was pulled into questioning. Trent was asked about approvals he never should have made. Karen, terrified, admitted that she had seen suspicious behavior for months but never reported it because she was afraid of losing her job. And Richard's confidence disappeared fast. The same man who had humiliated Daniel in public was now pacing alone in his office, speaking urgently into the phone, trying to save himself with words that no longer mattered. But the truth had already moved too far. Once a lie is exposed, it cannot return to power just because the liar is nervous. And Daniel did not return to watch the fallout. He was gone. He walked out of that building with his head up, his shoulders straight, and his dignity intact. No shouting, no dramatic speech to the whole office. Just quiet strength. The kind that does not need an audience to be real. 2 weeks later, the story became impossible to contain. The company launched an internal investigation. Outside auditors were brought in. Key accounts were frozen. Richard was placed on leave. Several employees were fired or forced to resign. And the financial scandal spread far enough that the office bigwigs who had spent years hiding behind polished smiles suddenly found themselves in real danger. Not rumor danger. Not embarrassment danger. Legal danger. Career-ending danger. The office, which had once felt untouchable, now felt like a house with cracks in every wall. And all of it started because one man refused to stay silent forever. When people heard Daniel had resigned, many expected bitterness. They expected revenge. They expected him to post angry messages, make threats, or run to the building yelling. But Daniel did none of that. He left with discipline, and that made his victory even stronger. Because real strength is not loud. Real strength is not chaos. Real strength is knowing exactly when to stand up, exactly when to speak, and exactly when to walk away. A month later, Daniel was offered another position by a different company. This one came with respect. Real respect. The kind that does not need to be forced. During his interview, the new director asked him, "Why did you leave your last job?" Daniel smiled a little and said, "Because I learned that staying silent in the wrong place can cost you everything." He got the job. Of course he did. Because good people with strong minds are often underestimated by the very places that do not deserve them. And as for the old office, the story spread through it like fire. The same people who used to laugh at Daniel now avoided saying his name. Melissa started her own quiet recovery, trying to explain that she only followed orders. Trent claimed he never knew the full story. Karen began telling people she had always sensed something was wrong. And Richard became a lesson, a warning. A man who thought he had power because he had a title, until the truth showed him how little power he actually had. But the real victory did not belong to the company. It belonged to Daniel, because he did not just expose corruption. He exposed how people treat kindness when they think it cannot fight back. He exposed how arrogance hides fear. He exposed how quiet people are often the ones carrying the most truth. And he proved something even bigger. You do not have to be loud to be dangerous. You only have to be prepared. So if you are watching this, and you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, talked down to, or made to feel small, remember Daniel. Remember the man who was mocked for being quiet. Remember the man who gathered the truth piece by piece while everyone else was busy laughing. Remember the man who resigned with dignity and left the powerful ones exposed. Because sometimes the person everyone thinks is the weakest in the room is the only one strong enough to bring the whole room down. And that is why the people who laughed at Daniel will never forget the day he walked out with their secret. Not because he screamed, not because he begged, but because he let the truth do what arrogance never saw coming. It ended the lie, and it ended them.